afternoon in Stockholm, Belarus, and Liberia. Good morning in Colombia, and hello all around the world to those viewing us. Welcome to this second version of Glocal Voices, an online dialogue space where Forum Seed wants to gather voices from civil society actors around the world, with the purpose of promoting exchange of experience and initiatives within civil society to face different challenging issues. I am Valeria SARAY, gender specialist and PMEL officer at Forum Seed, regional office for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I will be moderating today's conversation, gender-based violence. Are we being equitable? What does it mean to be equitable? Today, we have an extraordinary, interesting, and diverse group of guests. I will try to briefly present them so we can quickly start our webinar. Today with us, we have ZENABIA. She is founder and executive director of Impact Girls, a women-led an organization that is leading in promoting gender equality and education in Liberia. ZENABIA is currently a civic leader with interest in helping communities strive and succeed through organizing and implementing activities that influence transformation in her community and country. Also, we have from Belarus, TATIANA. She is Belarusian human rights lawyer with a specialization in international human rights law. TATIANA is particularly interested in international litigation of women's and children's human rights and national implementation of socioeconomic rights of women. She joined Belarusian women human rights organization, Her Rights, in 2019, and in 2020 became a director. We also are happy to welcome CARLI Castillo, trans no-binary person with studies in social science, arts, and gender. For 3 years, they has been working with the foundation Grupo de Acción y Apoyo a Personas Trans in the development of different projects aimed at the trans and LGBT population in Colombia. Last but not least, we warmly welcome NATIA GVIANISHVILI. Is the Advocacy Program Manager at RSSL, the Swedish Federation for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer, and Intersex Rights, with focus on Eastern Partnership countries and Russia. Before taking position at RFSL, Natia worked within the feminist and LGBTQ movement in Georgia, where she was involved in community building, research, advocacy, and visibility since 2009. We will have several rounds of questions for our guests, and for that, we will need to be very self-regulated to keep our answers short. I will be controlling the time for your answers. We need for you to take a maximum of 3 minutes in your interventions, so we can cover all the topics that we want you to share and also have time for some interaction with the online viewers that are watching us on Forum Seed, several social media channels. Hopefully, at the end of our talk, we will have enough time to bring some of their questions and comments so our guests can give some feedback. As a reminder, for people who are joining us on Facebook Live, you can send your questions to the chat on the broadcast. Before starting our conversation, we are going to share with all of you the next video that will introduce us to the matter.
What is gender-based violence?
I'm sorry, what?
Gender-based violence for me is any act that is perpetrated against a person's will and is based on their gender. Gender-based violence has a lot to do with unequal power.
Gender-based violence is rooted in hierarchies and power relations that stem from stereotypical and strictly polarized gender roles.
Gender-based violence, even though when we talk about gender, we mean both male and female, or as in masculine or feminine, but in most cases our primary victims are women and girls more than men.
As it is widely known, women and girls are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence. Gender-based violence undoubtedly includes domestic violence, which is a serious issue for Belarusian women and Belarusian society in general. According to sociological research, every second Belarusian woman experiences any form of violence, while every third experiences physical one.
At the same time, this type of violence is also consistently perpetrated against those individuals and groups that are perceived to break the dominant gender norms with their gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and even sex characteristics. This makes lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and intersex people another major target for gender-based violence.
Gender-based violence is an illness. It's inhuman. It's disgusting. It's evil. But if we all must fight against it, we have to fight it together with the boys and the men.
When we talk about gender-based violence, it is usually automatically associated with violence against women and girls.
However, gender-based violence is a global issue, and it affects all women, girls, and people with non-hegemonic gender identities.
So, gender-based violence is the way people use and abuse power and control against someone else based on their gender identity, gender expression, or perceived gender, which results in physical, sexual, or psychological harm. These acts violate an individual's human rights. Gender-based violence is also expressed in broader social dimensions such as economical and political violence or exclusion.
Gender violence presents different manifestations, such as sexual harassment, like comments, gestures, physical contact of sexual nature that are deliberate or repeated.
Sexual violence, correctional rape to convert their sexual orientation, marital rape.
Discriminative actions, sexist language, which consists of speech that reinforces and perpetrates gender stereotypes and status differences between women and men.
Street harassment.
Bullying in schools.
Lack of public safety, bad experience with health and social services.
Negative media portrayals.
Economical violence.
Political exclusion.
Psychological and emotional abuse.
Threats and intimidation. Consequently, there are different ways of exercising gender-based violence on women, girls, and people with non-hegemonic gender identities.
But who are the perpetrators?
Aha!
Non-partner violence is violence inflicted by someone you don't know well, like strangers or colleagues. However, violence is generally perpetrated by someone you are close to. This is known as interpersonal violence, which is perpetrated by either a friend or a family member.
Intimate partner violence is perpetrated by someone you are in an intimate partner relationship with a lover, partner, or an ex-partner.
From local authorities, police officers, or medical personnel.
From families and communities.
As a result of these inequities, Forensit works for a society in which all people are free and able to decide for themselves over their sexual orientation and gender identity without persecution or violation of their human rights.
We promote awareness among rights holders and duty bearers of the root causes and the consequences of sexual and gender-based violence and acknowledges that sexual violence is used selectively for strategic reasons.
Well, now let's go on with it. We would like to start by asking our guests today to share a brief and general context of how is the situation on gender-based violence in your country. We will start with ZENABIA. So please, ZENABIA, let us know a little bit about how things are going on in Liberia.
Thank you. Well, at the moment, in the Liberian context, gender-based violence is a national issue right now, based on the fact that there is an increase in incidents of gender-based violence, especially with rape and wife battering. And also another fact is that gender-based violence has been continued to be influenced by our traditional practices, religious practices, because Liberia is a country that has diverse traditional groups, religious groups. So most of those issues have been affecting the gender-based violence issue in Liberia, and also the weakness in law, in our laws, like for example, rape being a bailable case in Liberia is another issue. Government inadequate funding, particularly to Ministry of Gender and Social Protection, budgetary allotment, to kind of cater to situations or respond to victims whenever they are in need adequately. So we haven't right now at the moment, the latest update was we have around 700 um, rape cases alone. Rape cases alone, we have around 700 cases in Liberia. And those, most of those cases, we know that in the rural areas, most of those cases have not been under the spotlight. People don't know about them. We are just talking about cases that were reported. There are 700 in the rural places. So if we can just imagine what might be happening in the urban areas, then we can know that gender-based violence at the moment has been affected terribly and negatively by the COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Zenabia. And thank you for you being brief. Let's go on with Tatiana. Tatiana, please share with us how things are going on in Belarus.
For giving me the floor. I'll be trying to be as brief as Zenabia, but please feel free to cut me if I'm not. So I'll start with a legal framework, first of all. In Belarus, unfortunately, we don't have any definition in legislation of gender-based violence, of domestic violence, of sexism, stalking, or marital rape, or whatsoever. What we do have is the term of violence in family in the law that does not directly is not directly linked to the notion of domestic violence. We also don't have a general anti-discrimination law, which makes it super difficult for human rights organizations to fight discrimination cases. If I may add some context, in 2017, there was an attempt from the side of the Ministry of Internal Affairs to push through the law against domestic violence. However, it was heavily criticized by our president, Alexander Lukashenko, and it was later scrapped, which was very disappointing to all of us. So the law that we are using now is quite imperfect and does not provide effective protection since it does not cover partners, civil partners, ex-partners, ex-spouses, and as I mentioned, it does not provide for a number of cases of gender-based violence, for example, stalking. The second point I would like to say is that we have no official statistics on cases of gender-based violence, which means that we can only rely on numbers that are given to us through journalists or through the communication with press from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which makes it super difficult, again, to see the progress or to watch what's actually happening and what are the real numbers. Now, if I may say some Some personal insights from my work in our organization. 30% of our inquiries concern domestic violence, and it surprisingly does not always involve direct inquiry on domestic violence. For example, a woman may call us with a primary concern that does not involve, she does not mention that she's being beaten or whatsoever. And later on, as we talk to her, we see that actually there is violence there. And it is very alarming to us that this trigger simply does not go off. So she does not feel the urge to pack her things, take children, and leave immediately. And she sees it as, if not as a norm, but as something that she is helpless. She doesn't know what to do with this. And we see it as a pattern, unfortunately. So we can also say that there are stereotypes and stigma about violence against women. And we can also say that children, when they're seeing this violence in family, they adopt it and they become part of this vicious circle, which is extremely difficult to exit. My further point would be about the absence of proper training of the police, which is called militia in Belarus, and representatives of guardianship office. Unfortunately, when a woman calls militia and it arrives to family, it is their obligation to report the incident to the guardianship office. And then the guardianship office, in their turn, must initiate so-called social investigation to see whether the rights of children are violated. In reality, we see that there are numerous cases of violations of women's rights, because women are the primary caretakers of children. And when the police arrives, they tell women, they threaten her that they will take their children away, although it's not that easy and it's not provided by law to take away children in such cases, in such scenarios. Therefore, women become scared to call the police and they do not do it. So they basically are staying without any help, and they do not know their rights, which of course aggravates the general situation. And my, not final, but I'm moving to the end. My next point would be about economic violence. And I'm going to be talking about splitting the property in case of divorce, or even in case of domestic violence. So in many cases, it is women who must flee their dwelling, leaving all the things, the apartment behind, which means that she can be renting an apartment, she can be living in shelters, whereas the perpetrator, her, for example, husband, continues to stay in their jointly owned property. And in order for women to split the property, she must file a case to a court and pay 5% of the sum of the cost of the flat. And to the absolute majority of women, this sum is unaffordable. They simply do not have this money to pay it. Of course, the court can waive partly this court fee, but still, it's simply unaffordable. And free legal aid is also not provided to victims of domestic violence. So, in addition, women also have to pay to lawyers. And then my final point would be about LGBTIQ plus community in Belarus, although it's not focus group of our organization. Still, I must say that this March there was a petition which gathered more than 50,000 signatures to adopt a law prohibiting so-called propaganda against displaying gay relations that are diverting the image of family. And the most shocking thing was that our Ministry of Health reacted positively to that. And this was a real shock to our civil society community. And on this point, I think I can stop for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Let's go with Natia. Natia, please share with us how is the gender-based violence situation?
Yes, so as you might have guessed from the initial video that was played to our spectators today, my lens is not so much focused on the country that I'm based in today, which is Sweden, but it is more of the lens of the gender-based violence against LGBTQI people. And Tatiana mentioned some of the points that I will go into, but I will start by saying that the legacy and the consequences that LGBTQI people globally live with today are highly connected to past or present criminalization of homosexual relations, which is sort of used as a generic term which applies to any form of sexuality that falls outside of the accepted binary, and also often targets trans and non-binary people. And at the moment, we around the world we have at least 69 states that still criminalize homosexual relations, consensual homosexual relations. Which puts the communities in a very difficult situation, and there are prison sentences, and in a few cases even like death sentences for this. In the region that I focus on specifically, which is the Eastern Partnership countries and Russia, decriminalization of same-sex relations occurred between, sometime between the 90s and, early 2000s, because these type of relations were criminalized under the Soviet times. And this is unfortunately the legacy that we still have to live with. And this is the attitude and the position that we often face in the society from the politicians, etc. And we in our region seem to have a new wave of criminalizing legislation which targets, they're very tricky in not targeting, the relations specifically or, gender identity specifically, but they target the so-called propaganda of, homosexuality or, different gender identities. And this is based on the laws that have been in place in Russia since 2013, but also there are constant attempts of, spilling those laws over to different countries. I mean, there have been attempts in Moldova. We see now attempts in Belarus. There have been many attempts in Ukraine, and people have spoken about it, in Georgia and in other countries in the region as well. And so I would say this is something that shows a bit the weather in which our communities have to live in globally. So it will not be surprising for you to hear that the level of hate crimes, for instance, is quite high. The level of public hostility around the world is quite high against LGBTQI people. It is partially based on, lack of people's awareness about gender and sexuality, but also has to do with dominant political narratives as well, because we see many politicians up until this day using LGBTQI issues as tokens for political speculation, attacking their political opponents or driving their conservative agenda, as we now saw, for instance, in Hungary, which rolled back the legal gender recognition procedures for trans people. We saw the election campaign in Poland riding also highly on, the anti-LGBT rhetoric of one of the candidates. We see such reforms in Russia yet again. So this is the situation. While the legislation itself may differ from country to country, the stigma still remains high, and we sometimes face the situation where there are some things that are allowed by law, for instance, public assemblies, but we can't really enjoy them because there's so much opposition from different groups. I think I will stop here until the next question. This was just to give you some context before we dive into the COVID-19 and how it affects us. Thank you.
Thanks, Natia. Apparently, CARLI is having some connection issues, so we will talk with her more later. So later we will share the context of gender-based violence situation in Colombia. Well, as we can see how gender-based violence affects women, girls, and people with non-hegemonic gender identities, rights, and life, this is related to our next question. And we can start with Tatiana to talk a little bit about Belarus. How have these issues of gender-based violence been affected by the COVID-19 crisis? And here we would like to know if gender-based violence situation has worsened. Does the government's strategies, plans, and procedures to mitigate and face COVID-19 crisis have contributed in any way to worsening gender-based violence?
Thank you, Valeria. I think I will start answering the question with mentioning that, first of all, we in Belarus didn't really have any quarantine regime at all. We were one of the very few countries, in fact, I think Belarus and Sweden were the only countries in Europe that didn't close their borders. And officially, we didn't have any coronavirus at all, thanks to the position of our president, who numerously stated in his public appearances that it is all panic and we will fight it. So this is a very peculiar thing, because I think it is connected to the way that it has affected women in Belarus. I think it was early March when globally we started to receive messages that the level of domestic violence and gender-based violence has risen. But in Belarus, we didn't notice anything like that. We consulted in between women's rights organizations. We were contacted by journalists, but we didn't really notice any difference as we looked through the previous month. It was only in May when we started to experience this outburst of inquiries, for example, about domestic violence. So the numbers rose in 3 times. So now, really, it's still one of the top inquiries that we are receiving at our legal helpline. It is connected to domestic violence. So we connected to the fact that in Belarus it all started later than in Europe, Western Europe, and Asia and the Americas. I think it won't be a lie if I say that there were no really any protection measures specifically designed for women. In fact, I would like to refer to the research that was conducted by Belarusian Association of Working Women. It was about COVID and women, and so they asked the attitude, and they asked very specific questions. For example, did women hear about the the outburst of domestic violence and said yes, which means that people were not actually pleased with the information they received from the government. More than 88% of women that participated in the survey, they said that they are in stress because of the situation. They don't have enough information. They felt that they are misguided, which is also directly linked to the fact that our government supposedly did not provide true numbers of COVID victims, and there was a huge mistrust in the society. And also in that survey, we could see that, for example, women stated that their partner started to help them more during household duties, but at the same time, the previous question was what has changed when the coronavirus started, and women answered that, more than half of women answered that they started to spend more time doing their household duties. So still there is this stereotype that actually worsened because of coronavirus, and there's still this stigma that women should stay at home and cook, whereas both women and men are actually workers. For example, they are employed and they have same professional duties, for example. And finally, I should mention that women became affected more because they started to lose jobs. It is women who are predominantly occupied in the spheres of trade and spheres that deal with food industry. So once these small businesses started to close, of course, it were women who were asked to leave first. I hope I answered your question. If not, I'm ready to elaborate.
Thanks, Tatiana. You actually did. So now let's move on to ZENABIA. Let's go back to Liberia.
Yeah, the COVID-19 has affected the gender-based violence in Liberia seriously. Since it started, it has worsened the gender-based violence cases. Liberia, already we had a system that was weak, and then the COVID-19 kind of exposed how difficult, how terrible girls and women have been abused in their own homes, because we actually thought the home or the community should have been the safest place, or should be the safest place for women and girls. But the COVID-19 kind of teaching us that no, that's the wrong perception that we've had all this while. So the lockdown, there was a time in Liberia we had a lockdown almost like 5-6 months. The lockdown negatively affected the already weak system to address GBV and provide service and justice for survivors in Liberia. And law enforcement at that time were focused on enforcing laws, the stay-at-home law, the curfew, and others. They were focused on enforcing those laws, and they were not watching out. They were not considering whether women or girls were being abused in their homes. So now we have a rate of gender-based violence at its highest peak, where you have over 700 cases just for rape. Because we know that with gender-based violence, there are other issues like early marriage and all of those things, but wife battery. But at this point, we have the COVID-19 has kind of exposed how terrible and weak our system was, and how gender-based violence is enshrined in the fabric of our society. Initially, girls could go to school. Initially, women could go to the market. They could move around. But when the COVID-19 started and the lockdown was enforced, women and girls were compelled to stay home. And during those times, of course, most of our perpetrators are at home with us. They are in our community, in our schools, in our homes. And so most of the girls and women were being abused, and they couldn't go outside to report cases because of the lockdown. I mean, most women and girls kind of depend wholly on a man to provide in terms of feeding and other things. So because of that, a woman wouldn't want to turn her husband or her boyfriend in because of gender-based violence, only because she depends on him to feed and take care of her kids. So since the COVID-19 in Liberia, it's been a terrible situation. Most times with the work we do, we go to the communities and we see indicators, because when a woman is depressed, when a woman is going through abuses, you can tell from just looking at the indicators. If you've been like 80% of women go through abuses every day. So it's not something strange. So when we go to those communities and we look at those women, and yes, we see the indicators that they've been abused, but yet they won't come out to report those cases. And that is due to so many factors. And right now in Liberia, we don't even have active safe homes for victims. So, I mean, if the only place you have to live is where the perpetrator is, most of the women and girls right now in this COVID time are living in perpetual abuses. They are depressed, they are into it because they can't report those cases because of fear about not having another home to go to, not being protected, who will feed you, I mean, who is going to feed your kids? So COVID-19 is really teaching us a tough lesson. And recently there has been a tougher call of action, where in one of the appearances of the Vice of the Her Excellency, the Vice President of Liberia, Chief Dr. Madam Joawa Taylor, she said that they should start castrate men who are having issues like that, who are into rape and all of those things. So the number of sexual gender-based violence at this time is something we've never seen the numbers like that. The numbers are rising. I mean, that is to say, and those cases that have been reported are just cases that are under the spotlight. As I said initially, there are some isolated areas where we don't have local NGOs, we don't have um, women are not in policy, I mean, decision making right now because of this COVID-19. Public gathering is restricted. The way women used to come together before and talk about their common issues, things are no longer happening like that because of the social distancing and the public gathering restrictions. So Liberia right now is going through a terrible process, a terrible time, and it's difficult for most of the girls. And one of the things that is going to happen is after the COVID-19, we are going to have a higher rate of teenage pregnancy in Liberia first. Secondly, in most of those isolated communities where um, we don't normally go to due to so many factors, we're going to see early marriage because some of our religious practices here, traditional beliefs allow us to marry our daughters to men if they are raped. So when you have at this time you have a COVID-19 issue where you can't go to the police to report cases, most of our traditional people, the moment their daughters are raped, they just give them out to get married to that man. And it is something that is also on a higher rate. So COVID-19 has worsened the situation because we already had a weaker law enforcement system and commitment. So we are hoping that we have some new we are hoping that we can all come together, and as the vice president and other people, and even the vice president said recently, that we can start taking a tougher action in addressing gender-based violence issue in Liberia. Maybe if men if we can have a law that can be enforced, that men can be castrated or maybe killed, maybe somehow um, the numbers will start reducing, because we've been advocating. Women have been wearing black in Liberia even during this COVID time. Most of the organizations have been coming together demonstrating because of gender-based violence, but it seems to go on the high. There are some cases where you have a 2 years old girl, baby, being raped. There are other cases where you have a 8 years old girl being raped. So COVID-19 has really exposed how terrible our system has been, and how weak is our law enforcement when it comes to it. So far, I will pause. If there is anything additionally you might want me to add, then I can add.
Thanks, Zenabia. Now we have Carly with us again. So I'm going back to our first question. So, Carly, please share with us, how is the gender-based violence situation in Colombia? We cannot listen you.
Okay.
Now we can listen you.
Okay. Colombia is among leaders in the Latin America region on legislation and policies protecting the rights of trans individuals. A robust human rights framework, progressive constitution, and positive jurisprudence from the Constitutional Court have all contributed to this process. Specifically, the Constitutional Court protects the interests of the trans people through the jurisprudential development of three rights: the right to equality, the right to health, and the right to the free development of personality, to include the right to choose one's own identity. Also, gender identity is a prohibited ground of discrimination. Colombia's policy of the free development of personality is progressive in that it recognizes the capacity of all people to fulfill themselves individually and autonomously, without impositions of kind and without unjustified controls or impediments imposed by the state. In 2015, Colombia's Interior and Justice Ministers passed Decree 1227, which modifies the law which regulates the civil registry in Colombia, allowing sex rectifications in government issue identification for people who are 18 years or older with a simple declaration of will. However, the reality for trans individuals is also one of hardship, despite the fact that the Constitutional Court has developed jurisprudence to protect trans people from discrimination. Legal and administrative authorities often put their prejudiced views before the application of the law, or ignore the needs and registers of trans citizens. Furthermore, while Decree 1227 allows sex rectification in ID documents, the country's health system does not as yet allow trans people access to body transformation and hormone treatments without first undergoing a process of pathologization. Mm, South America's macho culture, combined with the strong influence of the Catholic Church, made it a particularly difficult place to be a transgender woman. In the past 8 years, 74% of our reported murders of trans people were in Central and South America. Due to the violence, poverty, and the risks of HIV, the life expectancy for trans women in Latin America is estimated at between 35 and 41 years. But the prejudice are hard to overcome. Trans women are particularly vulnerable. 65% of those murdered worldwide were sex workers, according. Um, Yet prostitution is one of only two jobs, along with hairdressing, available to most trans women in Colombia. Those who end up in sex work are mostly in Santa Fe, the notorious barrio in the eastern edge of Bogota. It estimated between 300 and 600 trans people working in the sex trade here. The situation for trans people is often stratified along class lines. Those who hold white-collar jobs and have university degrees are often, though not always, able to stay employed with the transition, but for others, things are much harder.
Thank you, Carly. Let's listen, Natia, to share with us how this COVID-19 situation has affected the gender-based violence situation for LGBT communities.
Yes, thank you. I will start by repeating that just as in case with violence against women and girls, or cisgender women and girls around the world, COVID-19 has exacerbated or magnified the pre-existing problems and challenges that the LGBTQI communities had around the world. And I will start by reading out excerpts from a quote from the letter co-signed by a huge number of UN independent experts and special rapporteurs that they published for May 17th, which is the International Day Against Homo, Bi, and Transphobia, where they start by saying that, yes, the pre-existing inequalities and discrimination are exacerbated in this pandemic, and that also the existence of criminal laws or criminalization of LGBTQI identities also makes the communities more vulnerable to police abuse, etc. But then they also continue to speak about the fact that while contributing to the fight against the pandemic by staying at home, LGBT children, youths, and elders are forced to endure prolonged exposure to unaccepting family members, which exacerbates rates of domestic violence and physical and emotional abuse, as well as damage to mental health. In many jurisdictions, LGBT persons, particularly those most impoverished or without proper documentation, which also refers to a lot of trans people, unfortunately, rely overwhelmingly on informal economies made impossible by COVID-19 restrictions. The socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic and the loss of income might also increase the vulnerabilities of LGBT persons to human trafficking and sexual exploitation. So this short quote shows you actually, and it's evidence-based, obviously, it's not that somebody came up with it. It is based on the information that the UN experts have been receiving from the LGBTQI movements around the world. This short quote shows you the whole can of worms when it comes to the problems and challenges faced by the communities that are really magnified under this pandemic. So what do we as RFSL see? We see really increased reports of domestic violence and other types of violence against LGBTQI people in this pandemic. Specifically, the region that I work with, our partner organizations are reporting increased demand on their services, mostly psychological, legal, and social services, which indicates that people are not doing well in this pandemic. We also see our partner organizations saying that, they're dealing with increasing number of, domestic violence cases reported by community members, and especially reporting by minors. And I think here we need to mention one thing, that unlike many other minority groups, LGBTQI people, we inherently often do not have support of our families, which makes us even more exposed and vulnerable to different risks on the socioeconomic spectrum, because in many countries, families serve as the support system for a person. We don't really have access to that, and the minors, especially in many countries. First of all, there is no sufficient infrastructure for services when it comes to children suffering from violence or other types of or different types of violence within the domestic settings. And second of all, in many countries, even if the services are actually exist, you need the permission of your parents, legal guardians, sometimes a teacher, basically an adult that either is already abusive towards you or you haven't come out to because you're afraid. So these children are put in impossible positions, and the organizations often cannot address their needs. So we've seen struggle of our partner organizations, in Moldova and in other countries, cooperating with the police and trying to get, these minors to safety. In addition, this logically also increases the number of, homeless youth among LGBT people, even in countries like UK, for instance, where one organization is actually reporting that, the number of minors seeking shelter and minors aged 16, 17 has increased during the pandemic, right? So this is another thing. Another problem when it comes to gender-based violence, also for adults, is in general lack of services or lack of shelters that are friendly, or where the staff is actually not hostile or is actually aware of the needs of the LGBTQI people, where the shelters are available. They're not always available. I mean, let's just accept that as a given. Another thing right now under the pandemic is that in many cases, the justice system, the functioning of a justice system has slowed down because a lot of the efforts of the law enforcement agencies has shifted towards enforcing the social distancing and quarantine, measures, rather than dealing with, ongoing issues such as gender-based violence, hate crimes, etc. So in the Eastern Partnership countries, while this hasn't been a huge problem, I mean, generally access to justice for LGBTQI people is an issue and is a problem. And we often face, this like informal deprioritization of the issues that are important to us compared to, bigger crises in the society. Another important thing is that LGBTQI refugees are facing a huge crisis right now because they're stuck even more in the environments that are often hostile towards them, without even less clarity about their future. And, the resources allocated to them are also shrinking. In addition, in countries where, again, homosexual relations are criminalized, like access to services and access to justice is completely it doesn't exist for LGBTQI people. And we saw how an LGBTI shelter in Uganda was raided in March, and people were arrested under the pretext of enforcing measures related to tackling the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is a very, very harsh situation. And I would like to finish by mentioning that also in many cases, we spoke about the informal economy, and we spoke about, or it was mentioned in the quote that I read out, and we need to understand that gender-based violence and hate crimes and different types of violence, they have a context. It's not just, a person wanting to hurt you, that this is not the only factor that enables them to do so, right? Your social and economic status and your access to resources can be, or lack thereof, can be a contributing factor here. So when it comes, for instance, to trans women, trans sex workers, they face very, very high numbers of, harassment and violence. They also face, the challenges to actually being able to provide for themselves because of COVID-19. In addition to that, more generally, a lot of the LGBTI people who are employed within the informal economies, especially in the countries where, the economy is generally weak, they are often not eligible for, state support. So even if the state rolls out, support by, like monetary support or, support, humanitarian aid of, food and hygiene products, you may not be eligible for that because either you don't have proper, identity documents, or you don't have documents that prove your previous employment because you were employed without the contract. So, and all of these things lead to higher rate of exclusion, higher rate of violence, and higher rate of, mental health and emotional well-being issues. And I will stop now until the next question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natia. Let's go back to Colombia. CARLI, how gender-based violence situation has been worsened because of the COVID-19 crisis?
Unfortunately, the quarantine measures in the different cities in Colombia have been a risk for trans people, especially for those who live from sex work, since with the restrictions on people's mobility, their economic income was undoubtedly affected, in addition to the increase in police controls in the areas where trans women work. One of the most controversial measures that were adopted in Bogota, and that will later be replicated in other cities of the country, was the restriction of going outside to the streets of people according to their gender. For example, if men go out on Monday, um, only women can go out on Tuesday. This was very difficult for all trans people, especially those with non-binary experience or those who do not meet the standard of what is socially accepted, as the measure not only represented a risk to their integrity, but also a constant fear of being insulted or not being attended in the commercial establishment. During the measure, several complaints were filed in Bogota by trans women being expelled from supermarkets on the grounds that they were supposedly men and that this was not their day, no their day to go out in the streets. It's important to mention also Bogota has become more inclusive in recent years and elected a lesbian as a mayor in the last year. Conservative views on sexual and gender norms remain a motivating politic force in the country. The situation of trans people in Colombia is dire. In June alone, recorded 6 trans women murdered in Colombia and other allegedly assaulted by the police. The police that were put in place to address the pandemic have only made matters worse. Trans people feel persecuted, exterminated, and have a constant sense of powerlessness. On May 29 and on May 29th, Alejandra Monocuco, a trans woman sex worker, drowned in her home in Santa Fe neighborhood of Bogota. Her roommate, when she noticed she couldn't breathe, decided to call an ambulance. It took about 45 minutes for the ambulance to arrive, and when paramedics finally got there, something was off. As soon as they noticed the gate and trans people around, the urgency of the situation seemed to disappear.
Thanks, CARLI. Well, as we can see, gender-based violence is promoted by weakness in law and lack of training of or sensitiza- sorry, and lack of training in institutions like Belarus and Liberia, cultural matters, lack of awareness and stigmas. And this can be reflected in the violence that LGBT people suffer due past criminalization on non-hegemonic gender identities or sexual orientations. But also, we can see that homes are the common places where women, girls, and people with non-hegemonic gender identities suffer gender-based violence. And within this COVID-19 situation, where we have to be in our homes, women, girls, and LGBT suffer this different type of violence. We can see that they suffer also lack of services and bad experience with health and social services. So the COVID-19 crisis add more barriers and restrictions to women and LGBT people to access and control different types of resources to guarantee their living conditions. So this COVID-19 situation has magnified and exacerbate gender-based violence everywhere. So we have a question from Sweden, from Paulina to ZENABIA. So traditional laws seem to have a negative impact on sexual gender-based violence. Are the current efforts to work with churches traditional leaders? We cannot listen to you, Zenabia.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Okay. So this based violence, we have to fight it comprehensively. That's the only way we can win. So we have to bring everyone to the table. We've been I mean, most of us, what we are doing as CSOs, we are bringing together traditional leaders, churches. We want them to see the positive side of what our advocacy is. We are not saying we want to change their laws, but if a law is not good for the people, then it's not a law. So we've been working with them comprehensively, bringing everyone to the table to see how best, because what affects one sector of a community affects all. But then, unfortunately, struggling with issues like that, then we had COVID-19 that came in and kind of dwindled the entire effort. So it's a fight we will continue. But yes, we have been able to bring together traditional leaders, because the traditional leaders are the ones who will take the girls normally and take them to the bushes to do the female genital mutilation. So we cannot be talking about girls have the right to go to school, they need to stay in school and graduate, and we cannot bring the traditional leaders to make them to understand the importance of girls, of the education of girls' child. So we've been working with them comprehensively so that we can achieve a positive goal. But the COVID-19 has dwindled all that. So we still have a lot to do. So after the COVID-19, we have to continue from where we left off. Thank you so much. That was a great question.
Thank you, Zenabia. Considering the above, what are the challenges in your work to face gender-based violence, in particular for the work that civil society organizations carry out to prevent, mitigate, and face gender-based violence? We can start with CARLI. So, CARLI, go ahead. So, CARLI, what are the challenges in your work to face gender-based violence? Okay, so let's go back to Natia. What are the challenges in your work to face gender-based violence?
Yes, thank you. I think speaking on behalf of the many partners that we have, in many cases, the challenge when it comes to tackling gender-based violence against LGBTQI people is lack of political will in many countries when it comes to actually implementing the or adopting the laws, but also implementing them when it comes to protecting LGBTQI people, and that's an important thing. With the COVID-19 pandemic, I think the challenges are growing. Unfortunately, the right-wing populism and the surge of conservative attempts to roll back some positive reforms that have been happening in some countries when it comes to rights of the LGBTQ people. These attempts haven't stopped. They actually continued with a new force during the pandemic, and we already mentioned Hungary and Poland and Russia, as well as other countries. And unfortunately, this comes in a context where there are also other powers other than the politicians that are trying to quote Michelle Bachelet, who's the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, LGBTI people are also in some places being treated as scapegoats for the spread of the virus. So we've been seeing, for instance, religious leaders and leaders of the anti-gender movements around the world saying that COVID-19 is God's punishment for LGBT issues and whatnot, and this will in future as well contribute to increasing stigma against our communities, which in turn will make it more difficult to tackle the issues of gender-based violence against us. In addition, current deprioritization of certain issues in the legal systems, for instance, could be a problem, which also leads to challenges. Access of the organizations and civil rights groups to resources, both humanitarian resources, but also the resources that are needed for their continued and undisrupted work. To provide legal assistance, for instance, to the survivors, provide social assistance to the survivors of violence. This is another important challenge right now. And another challenge that we are currently facing is the uncertainty about the lobbying and advocacy spaces, both national and international, that LGBTQI groups all over the world have been using to, pass their message through and, achieve at least some change on the ground. Right now, we're facing that, these spaces are either, partially shutting down, some events are postponed, and we still are trying to figure out what will be the scope of participation of the civil society in those spaces if the format stays digital or if we keep postponing them. So I would say that there is a huge number of challenges that we are trying to figure out how to tackle in these difficult times. Thank you.
Thanks, Natia. Let's go back to Colombia with CARLI. CARLI, what are the challenges in your work to face gender-based violence?
We are working for the accompaniment and support for trans women. We make an enormous effort to influence all the ranks to guarantee the rights of trans people. Now we are working on a project with Venezuelan people who have arrived in the country and must constantly face violence. During the quarantine, we have tried to guarantee some help, taking into account the trans women having work.
Thank you, CARLI. So let's move on to Tatiana. What are the challenges in Belarus context?
Can Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I would like first to refer to stereotypes that we have in our society, which is still very patriarchal. If we talk about domestic violence, it is first of all victim blaming. So women are still blamed for finding themselves in the situation of violence. It is also sexism, which is almost impossible to combat because we, as I mentioned before, we don't have the definition of, for example, if you want to report a sexist advertisement, we need to refer to it as unethical, and these two terms are not equal at all. Then I would like also to underline the point that NATIA has already made, this lack of shelters. We do have state-owned crisis rooms. However, they're not designed specifically for victims of domestic violence, for example, without children. They also accommodate victims of human trafficking, refugees, which can create quite a traumatizing experience for a woman who is already experienced great trauma in her family environment. And then finally, I'd like to go back also to the point that I have already made about absence of adequate legislation. And I'm talking not only about national legislation, but also absence of regional legal framework. Belarus is not part of Council of Europe, so we're not part of the Istanbul Convention, for example, and we cannot go to the European Court of Human Rights. So there is no regional instrument to influence the situation at international level, because we can apply through the optional protocol to CEDAW, to the CEDAW committee. However, Belarus is notoriously famous for not paying any attention to the recommendations made either by CEDAW or the Committee on Human Rights, because they're not obligatory, so-called obligatory, at least as the Belarusian government sees it. I think it is crucial to adopt an effective national legislation. I know there are different points of views. Some think that the law against domestic violence, for example, it's not a magic pill that would immediately resolve all problems. I don't understand that. However, taking into account Belarusian context, then again, this is what Natia has already mentioned, which bears a heavy stamp of Soviet heritage, which means that this is a heritage of positivism. What is written in the law, it should be directly applicable. There is very little room for interpretation by judges or by state officials. At least there is no tradition of elaborating or interpreting the law. So that's why I'm in the position of advocating adoption of all possible laws against domestic violence, against sexism, complex anti-discrimination law, because I firmly believe this is what Belarus urgently needs. Thank you.
Thanks, Tatiana. Let's go back to Liberia. ZENABIA, what are the challenges in Liberian context?
Were you talking to me? I didn't hear you. Sorry.
Sorry. What are the challenges in your work to face gender based violence?
Okay, well, there are so many challenges. Corruption with the justice system is one of them. Poor road infrastructure. There are so many isolated communities that we can't get to with our advocacy. We can't get to know what's happening in those communities. So they are kind of isolated because of the bad road condition and also out of court settlements. Because of our traditional practices, most families will tell you, yes, of course, the rape happened, for example, but he is our relative, so we can't stand and watch him go to jail. So we'll prefer having this issue settled at home. So while you were pushing for justice for the victim, the family is saying, no, we can settle this at home out of the court. And you know that you cannot fight a rape case if the victim is not willing to be evidence to explain what happened. So that is one of the many challenges we have, and also the stronghold of traditional, cultural, and religious beliefs. In some religion, if rape happens, people will say we will settle it in our community, which is the religious community. And some will say, based on our tradition, she is our daughter, she has been raped. So the only thing we can do is for for her to get married to the man. So it's also a challenge that you're trying um, to get someone justice, but they don't see it that way. The best way to see it is because um, is for them for their child to get married to the perpetrator, and also because they want to avoid being stigmatized is also another challenge. Weakness in the law in their enforcement, for example, rape. Before, when we had Madam Helen Johnson Sirleaf, our former president, rape was a non-bailable case. But since the new government we have now, rape has become a bailable case, which means if you rape, you can be invited to the police station, but yet you'll be in a very community where you committed a rape while investigations are going on. And we know that something like that is not a favorable thing to do if we must fight against rape and win, because perpetrators being at large in the community has so many influence over the victim and the victim's family. So it's also a challenge. And poverty, most people will settle for some monies or something because of poverty. If someone's daughter is being raped, and maybe this person is an influential person, they have a good job, everything is working for them, and their son or they themselves rape someone, maybe they might offer to give 1,000 or 1,000 or $2 to the victim. And looking at the background of the victim's family and how poor they could say, yes, well, this is a blessing. And why would we want to take such a man to court when he's willing to give us 2,000 US, maybe 5,000 US, based on their class or their position or whatever they are doing? So that's another challenge. So at that point, the person will not be saying what you will be saying as an advocate, but they will rather be looking at the monies that the person is willing to put on the table to buy their silence. Another challenge is literacy. For example, in Liberia, we have the male literacy is 62.7%, and the female literacy is 34%. Most women and girls don't even know their right. They don't even know where to take issues, how to report issues to duty bearers. They don't know. They can't read, they can't write. And because of also the bad road, there are so many places we just can't be all of the time. We can't just go to and tell them. So most women don't even know their rights. They've been humiliated, intimidated, abused, and they are there, not because they want to be there, but because they don't even know what their rights are. And Another challenge could be the victim themselves. There are so many times we try getting into issues like that, but when you are trying to tell the victim, come out and speak, break the culture of silence, sometimes, most times, they don't want to do that. They don't want to be stigmatized. They don't want people to look at their families in an ugly way. They don't want people to know they've been raped. They feel it's degraded. It will drive people away from them. So there are so many challenges when it comes to dealing with gender-based violence, and also more like initially I talked about the safe home. Safe homes are very much important and key in fighting gender-based violence because most of the victims do not have alternative homes to go to. So if a girl is at home with her uncle and the uncle is paying her school fee and she is staying there, if the uncle goes to her every night to abuse her, she will cry over that. Inside, she will feel bad about it, but she's not going to go anywhere to explain to anyone because that's the only home she's got. That's the only person she knows. That's the only person who understands what her needs are. So you will realize that girls, most of them will be in perpetual abuses in their homes, but then would prefer to be there and not go outside. And another challenge, lastly, I want to make a point. Another challenge is the challenge of breaking the silence, the culture of women not speaking up, the culture of girls not wanting to come up to speak because other women, some of the other women might even look at you like, are you stupid? Do you really want to go out there and tell people that you were raped? And there are times this thing about rape happens, and sometimes it's even difficult to explain. There are some professional women, well-to-do women, women who are working and are doing everything, and they got raped. But in the first place, when you sit and you start and you are like, if I'm to tell those people I got raped, they are going to ask me questions like, you are educated, how did you manage? That is the first thing. And one simple thing nowadays is the moment you hear someone got raped, people will be asking, what was she wearing? Like rape is justifiable because of what people wear. So what about the babies that have been raped? 2 years, 3 years, what were they wearing? That's the question most times I ask. So the challenges are immense. There are so many of them that sometimes can even frustrate you, the advocate, about because you want to talk for people, you want to stand for people who know what they want, who know what you're going to go through because you want them to get justice. But at a point in time, some of the victims, I mean, they don't even understand what their right are. They don't even understand what might happen to them in the long run because they've been raped. So those are some of the challenges, except if you want me to add any other information on that, then I can.
Thank you, Zenabia.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
so much.
Yeah.
Before to go ahead to our next and final question, we have some questions for our viewers.
Mm.
So I have this question, and this is a question for all our guests, and it's from Adiambo Gilan. I'm so sorry if I pronounce bad your name. And the question is, considering that most violence is by known perpetrators, mostly at home, how are we targeting parents, caregivers as key players in engaging in matters of gender-based violence? So, who wants to start first, or who wants to answer this question?
Yeah, I would like to start.
Go ahead.
Okay. Could you please display the question again so I just see? Okay. So it's true that most violence is with known perpetrators at home, in communities, at school. And how are we targeting parents, caregivers? Okay, so the first thing, one of the things we've been doing is we've been bringing caretakers to our forums. We've been bringing parents to our forums and guardians. Now, there are times people get raped, but they don't even know the future um, negative effects it has on them. So most times parents will not even bother reporting those cases. They will just sit them at home because they themselves don't even know. So we've been talking to caregivers, and most times when we have our gender-based violence awareness, we bring on board caregivers so they get to explain to the people. Because when parents see caregivers by your side and you are raising awareness on negative effect of gender-based violence on their children, they will take it serious. They will know that it is everybody's business. Everyone should be concerned about it. It affects everyone. Parents need to know that there is a law. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why we need to be rigid with the law when it comes to rape. We need to make sure enforcement is done diligently, because most people know that the laws are there, but they won't take it serious and nothing happens after that. So bringing caregivers, bringing parents and guidance, and making them to understand the importance of reporting rape cases is very much important. And one of the unfortunate thing about rape is the victim has to be willing. If the victim is not willing, you can't do anything beyond that. So we have to expand our advocacy, expand it, and make it in a way that will bring people to the table, especially so the men and the boys. They need to know that it is wrong. They need to know that they should be there protecting women and girls and not should be a prey on them. So I think that's what we should continue doing, because I know most of the CSOs have been doing that, but we need to continue doing more of that and expand our coverage on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Zenabia. And now Natia wants to answer this question too.
Yeah, I can quickly say that I mean the specific tools or strategies chosen may differ, but one of the most worldwide used tactic when it comes to targeting parents and caregivers is having parent support groups or peer groups. That a lot of LGBTQI organizations try to, start within the frames, and there are even parent organizations on their own, which helps them both understand, the sexuality and gender identities of their children, but also overcome the social sort of stigma that they as parents face as well, because not only we as LGBTQI people are stigmatized, but sometimes our parents, if they choose to accept us, for instance, are scapegoated for our identities. So these are mostly the type of things that we're trying to do, but it's still it's still pretty hard. Yeah.
Thank you, Natia. And now we have a question from Colombia, and this is again a question for all of guests. So she asks, is there any difference in the gender-based violence in urban and rural contexts in your countries? And she also wants to know, does gender-based violence related policies in your countries include LGBTQ plus population in any way as target groups who are also broadly affected by gender-based violence issues? So who wants to start? Natia?
Yeah.
I
So somebody else was speaking. I think Tatiana wanted to say something. I can very quickly say about the Eastern Partnership countries in Russia. When it comes to policies and inclusion, in most cases, the broad definition of gender-based violence is missing from the laws in the countries where we work. I mean, there are provisions against domestic violence, but they're not particularly inclusive of LGBTQI people. Only 3 countries in our region, which is Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, have the anti-discrimination laws, which directly or indirectly cover sexual orientation, gender identity as the protected grounds. So I could say, and hate crimes laws are also absent. So I would say that LGBTQI people are vastly excluded from a lot of provisions that tackle, domestic violence issues or, women's rights. So and the organizations have been working on the integration and mainstreaming of these issues, but it's been an uphill battle because of lack of the political will.
Thank you, Natia. Tatiana, would you want to answer this question too?
Yeah, but Natia has pretty much said everything about the second question. Yes, LGBTIQ plus people are excluded at all, if not erased from the from the agenda. But going back to the first question, yes, there is a difference in urban and rural context. And then again, I think I won't lie if I say not only about Belarus, but about, for example, Russian context, because they're very similar in this regard. In major cities, it is more or less okay. People are more educated, if I may say so, and their level of legal literacy is higher. And also in rural areas, unfortunately, there is a high level of alcoholism, which really affects the issue of, for example, domestic violence. And then again, I'm also going back to the stereotypes. This is something that ZENABIA was saying. Women are ashamed sometimes to say that their husbands beats them. It could be one scenario, and second scenario could be that they are afraid to seek help because they think no one will help them. At the same time, the community they are living in, for example, a small village or even a small town, they keep silence about them, although they know it. So they're hearing these loud screams every day, every night, and they hear how the aggressor beats up his wife or his children, but they do nothing about it. So, yeah, unfortunately, in rural areas, the situation with domestic violence or even, I would say, gender-based violence is even worse.
Thank you, Tatiana. Well, as our guest shared with us, one of the main challenges everywhere is to fight patriarchal cultural patterns and institutions, which blames the victims and brings shame and stigmatizes them. Another essential point is the lack of political will in terms of implementing laws that protect victims from gender-based violence in national, regional, and international levels. Also guarantee health services to people with non-hegemonic gender identities, and also breaking the silence. Well, I'm going to continue with our final question for the webinar, and then I will continue with the questions that our viewers are doing to our guests. So, taking into account this diversity of challenges that organized civil society face, what are civil society organizations in urban, rural, and insulated communities and other stakeholders doing? Or what should they do to face gender-based violence in your context? So let's start with ZENABIA. So please, ZENABIA, let us know a little bit about what are Liberian civil society organizations and other stakeholders doing to face gender-based violence. We cannot listen you.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, CSOs is a major contributing factor for the increase in the reports of the incidents, especially in the urban areas, because without the CSOs, we will not be having all of the cases that have been reported. And so CSOs have been doing very well. They've been into advocacy, raising awareness, civic engagements, all gearing towards how we can eradicate gender-based violence. I said initially that in some of the isolated communities, it's been a challenge because some places CSOs cannot get to because of the poor road condition and all that. During raining season, it's worse because you can't just find your way through. But CSOs have been proactive in fighting against gender-based violence. We have some CSOs that have been, having public gathering, demonstrating about rape, genital mutilation, so many things. So I think we were doing lots more better before the COVID-19 came and kind of um, turned everything upside down. So I also believe that we have a lot to do. And we need to keep raising awareness, keep engaging our communities, our families, parents, caretakers, everyone comprehensively. We must bring everyone to the table, especially the boys and the men, because they are the perpetrators. We cannot have a peaceful home if mom and dad are not collaborating together. So if we must eradicate gender-based violence, it means we need to bring boys and men to the table. They need to see that what they have been doing is bad, is evil, is inhuman. They need to understand their role in the community, because if it is not because of them, we won't have women being abused. It's difficult to see a woman harassing another woman or abusing another woman or raping another woman. I'm not saying things like that don't happen, but we hardly see it. So we need to bring the men together. CSOs have to work collectively with the community, the men, the boys. We need to keep talking about it, and especially with our laws, we need to make sure that and laws and enforcement in terms of dealing with rape are implemented to the best as it is on the book. So we need to put duty bearers to their feet. We need to hold them to their feet. We need to make sure we make them to know that we know what's supposed to be done if someone is being raped, and make sure they enforce those laws, because that's the only way. And most especially, I think we also, if the resources are there, CSO should also invest more in building safe homes, because we need to create a safe space. We need to create safe spaces for victims where they will feel free, where they can be counseled, where they can heal. Because, for example, rape is not an easy thing. The effect of the flashback is what disturbs your entire life as you grow even older when you've been raped. So we need to look at those things, and we need to find resources that can enable us to do some of those things. Yeah.
Thank you, ZENABIA. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So let's go back to Colombia with CARLI. So please share with us what are Colombian civil society organizations and other stakeholders doing to face gender-based violence?
Mm, in my foundations, we offer support and accompaniment for to trans people and their families, so that they are fully aware of their rights. One of the reasons why trans people do not have full access to their rights is that they are victims of social exclusion from childhood. So we believe that supporting trans children and their families is essential to gradually stop prejudice and discrimination. Mm, on the other hand, we will continue to advocate for the state to the fully guarantee access to rights for the trans people. Thanks.
Thank you, Carly. Let's move on to Natia. But before, I would like to say that we are being watched from Liberia, Colombia, Sweden, Bolivia, and Kenya. So, Natia, please go ahead.
Yes, I think I will focus a little bit more on the COVID-19 context because I think it is important to mention that it's not business as usual, and we a lot of the human rights organizations and community-based organizations had to basically reshape their activities. So when it comes to violence against LGBTQI people, as well as other challenges that we're facing in this pandemic, the LGBTQI movement showed incredible flexibility and resilience all over the world by basically immediately shifting, their activities online where possible. Of course, everyone is aware of the problem of connectivity, and that not everybody has access to internet. And some of the organizations have been trying to tackle that by providing phones or like airtime to their constituencies, but there's a limited number of people that you can cover with your resources as a non-governmental organization. So shifting the legal counseling, for instance, online, still staying accessible as much as possible to the communities is one of the things that they have been doing. In the environments where it's possible, the organizations continued to talk to the authorities about specific cases of violence and discrimination, cyberbullying, which has emerged as not emerged, but has magnified as an issue lately as well. And I know that there was a question about the stimulus packages. Now I'll just answer it here because it's part of what the organizations have been doing. So we spoke about the fact that violence is exacerbated by lack of access to financial support and social support, and a lot of organizations have been struggling to have local fundraising campaigns and get some sort of humanitarian aid to people. In Georgia, for instance, the majority of the recipients of at least a couple of rounds of those humanitarian aid campaigns stemming from the NGOs were trans people and trans sex workers specifically. So I think that many are aware of the fact that the issue is problematic. However, I think that when we speak about what the NGOs need to do, especially under these current circumstances, we cannot only focus on the local organizations, but we also need to focus on the donor organizations, intermediary organizations, but also states and bigger intergovernmental organizations, because the resources, as I said, are scarce. And they have to be available, and humanitarian resources, especially a lot of the funding that the NGOs are receiving is not earmarked for humanitarian aid, which means that their ability to relocate some of the funding that they currently have from the activities that have been canceled to providing humanitarian aid is not possible. So what has been done is that there has been an ongoing negotiation. There have been donors that have provided support for humanitarian aid, but I think that more efforts will be needed as we go along. Yeah, I think I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Natia. So let's go back to Tatiana. So Tatiana, what are Belarusian civil society organizations and stakeholders doing to face gender-based violence?
Okay, so there is a number of NGOs that offer services to women, to LGBTIQ plus people, free of charge and confidential. We are one of these NGOs. We provide legal help for free. And the COVID hasn't really affected us and our capacities. Yes, there are more inquiries than usual, but we still manage them. And to answer more deeply the question, I think the good thing is that the civil society in Belarus started to collaborate more. And started to build more partnerships together. However, answering to the part of what should stakeholders do, I'm not a big fan of criticizing, but I really think that, and I wish our government did more and put more efforts into shielding women and other vulnerable groups from the consequences of coronavirus and gender-based coronavirus and gender-based violence, because there were no policies specifically mentioning the rise of domestic violence or the situation with gender-based violence in Belarus. So the consequences of this wave of coronavirus were left to deal only for the civil society sector. This was not surprising to us. However, I wish we could build a real safe partnership with the government, because in nature. It may sound a bit philosophically, but the role of civil society organizations and specifically human rights organizations is to be watchdogs and to see and to point to the government the areas that are left blank, because they are the primary entry points. They work in the field and they see where are problematic areas. So when we do point out to the government and tell them, listen, there is something that you should do because we are not in the position to do this, unfortunately, there is no proper interaction and there is no effective result in this kind of communication, to my deep regret. So in conclusion, I'd like to repeat that I think we became stronger as a civil society because a whole new range of initiatives has sprung up from this because of coronavirus. Many people started to volunteer, they started to organize between themselves. But I think that this was done only because our government failed to do this. So people did this on the behalf of the government. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Well, so now we are going to back to the questions from our viewers. So we received a question from a viewer at Forum Seat Liberia office directed to Natia and CARLI. Transsexual workers who don't not have protected contracts jobs, what are civil society groups and partners doing to provide a stimulus package to these groups affected by COVID-19? So I don't know if Natia or CARLI wants to start.
I can just quickly reiterate my answer that, like in many cases, as also Tatiana said, the NGOs have to take on this responsibility of providing humanitarian aid, and sometimes it could be NGOs or it could be informal, initiative groups who, with local fundraising, with some grants that they were able to secure, were able to actually provide this support. And I've seen numerous examples of that in the region that I work with, but most particularly in Georgia, for instance. There was a specific fundraising campaign aimed at helping, trans women, trans sex workers, trans community in general, but also then a fewer number of homeless persons within the LGB community as well. But the majority of the recipients of the support were trans people. And they also advocated with the government for receiving some additional support, but it was like very little. So there have been efforts. Unfortunately, I don't have like the fullest extent of picture of what's been happening, but I think that the organizations and groups have been aware globally about this issue and have been helping out as much as they possibly could. Thank you.
During the quarantine, we made an effort to secure food aid to the transgender women sex workers in various parts of the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Carly. And now, well, we have a lot of questions from our viewers. So I'm going to make this question, and it's related to what measures have the governments put in place to curtail issues of gender-based violence? So I don't know if Tatiana or ZENABIA wants to start to answer this question.
I can just reiterate what I have already said. There were no specific measures implemented by Belarusian government to address the issue of gender-based violence because of the COVID-19. However, now, as as I have read the question, I have remembered that I think a month ago or so, they made we have a national hotline for the victims of domestic violence, which was made just a month ago, free of charge, but it's just for one specific mobile provider. Still, it's something that was negotiated for a while. It's a very little thing, but really I can't just imagine of anything else, unfortunately.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, ZENABIA.
Yeah, well, for us in Liberia, the government did establish a hotline service and has been promoting that on different radio stations and social medias where victims can report cases of gender-based violence, and also where victims do not feel safe, they could call those lines and they could get medical services and other supports. And also recently, there was a call for a tougher action where now our government is saying that when men do rape, we should castrate them electrically. I like that too. So that's why I'm smiling. Yeah, so I believe that maybe that could curtail the high rate of gender-based violence in Liberia, because right now it's on every radio, every morning, every day. That's the first news you get to hear. Someone has been raped, a baby, a girl, someone, it's everywhere. So we are hoping that all of these measures the government has put in place can curtail the higher rate of gender-based violence issue in this COVID-19 time. Thank you.
Thank you, ZENABIA. Natia, Carly, do you want to add something related to this final question about the measures that governments put in place to curtail issues of gender-based violence?
No.
Yeah, I think I would be repeating myself from previous, so let's just.
Okay, so well, we receive a lot of questions from our viewers. So thank you so much to our viewers for all your great and interesting questions. But time is up. So we hope you have enjoyed this dialogue and take care. We want our viewers to know that these are issues that Forum Zip is working on actively, and we will continue to address the situation on human rights and a space for civil society around the world. On next sessions, we will have Glocal Voices from other regions join us to co-share and co-learn about different perspectives of these issues. So keep your eyes open for that. And thank you so much to our guests, to ZENABIA, TATIANA, CARLI, and NATIA. Thank you very much for your time and valuable insights. And thanks for watching. Until next
Thank
time.
you. Thank you.